This is Module 4, the Initiatic Mysteries of Classical Antiquity. We're going to be considering the Osirian mysteries, the mysteries of Osiris. To begin, we're going to look at the Egyptian priestly schools. The most ancient, which provides us with a basic mythology of the evolution of the gods, that at Heliopolis. The first priestly sanctuary that belonged to the first dynasty established by King Menes, that of Memphis. Then we're going to look at the ruling priestly theology that was established finally at Thebes, which became the main administrative and religious center of Egypt as it expanded up into the Nile River. And finally, we're going to look at Hermopolis, the city that retained many of the greatest of Egyptian teachings that used only hieroglyphics and demotics to transmit its knowledge, and was probably the starting point and probably the connecting point for the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus. Now, Heliopolis is an ancient city with an ancient priesthood. The Greek name that we know of it today means the city of the sun. It is the central location to which two of the lines of sight from the Great Pyramid fields point, that of Giza and Abu Sir. And the pyramids, in fact, are lined up in such a way as to point directly to Heliopolis. Heliopolis was a very important sacred center. Of course, the Egyptian name of Heliopolis was not this Greek name, but it was the way we generally know this city. If we take a look at ancient Egypt, we see that it was not shaped like England or Macedonia or anything else. It was not bounded by mountains and things like this. It was defined by one thing and one thing only, and that was the Nile River. So Egypt grew and expanded and connected along the Nile River, and the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt by King Menes, who established the first dynasty and established the first royal priesthood at Memphis, which you'll see is a little bit below Heliopolis, was carrying on a process that actually continued throughout the ages. Now, this is Heliopolis. Heliopolis, as you can see, is really the northernmost sacred city or temple city for ancient priesthood. When King Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt, and by Upper and Lower, we mean the lower river is the river as it approaches sea level, as it is coming down from higher levels. And Upper Egypt is the river as it comes from its sources in the higher levels. When he united these two, which were really about just the first third or so of the river that we see above, this became his sacred city, Memphis. And at Memphis, there was a priesthood established. His royal tomb is there, and this at Memphis developed a specific kind of theology that was headed by the god Ptah. Now, this is Abydos. Abydos is the place that we look to for the Osirian mysteries. The Osirian mysteries that we're going to experience and take you through were centered at Abydos in underground caverns that have not yet been found or excavated. Now, Thebes becomes the main priestly center for Egypt as it expands its unity up and down the Nile River. And the Theban priesthood is one we want to look at in order to understand what it was that was developed that was disturbed for about 18 years by King Akhenaten. And we want to understand how that theology related to perhaps the Jewish theology that developed, the Israeli and the ancient Hebrew religion. Now, there's some other places we want to look at. Right below Abydos is a place that will become very important many, many, many years later, and we will be talking about it in this sequence. This is a place called Nag Hammadi, near Kennebaskian, and it is here that the Coptic Gnostic Library was discovered. This is a location of Akhmim. Akhmim was a very important city that had its own language and dialect, and this city is the place to which the Pythagoreans and the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics retreated after the 3rd century violence done against the philosophers in Alexandria and associated with the Library of Alexandria, the eventual burning and destruction of the Library of Alexandria, and the tearing apart of Hypatia, who was the great Neoplatonic philosopher and prophetess. And this is the place, Akhmim is the place to which the mystery traditions of really Egypt and Greece retreated as Christianity became the law of the land. And it was at Akhmim that many centuries later, the Islamic conquerors found and discovered the communities that preserved these writings, including the writings of Plato and Aristotle, as well as the more esoteric writings of Empedocles and so on, and their traditions, and translated them, made them their own, and they would eventually make their way into Europe during the time of the Crusades through various sources such as the Knights Templar and private expeditions to purchase these manuscripts, and that began the Renaissance in Europe. This area is the place where the Nile River goes over a lot of waterfalls. They're called cataracts. This is called the first cataract of the Nile. It's at a city called Elephantine. You can see the Nile widens out. Actually, as a matter of fact, that particular city is on an island that's in the middle of the Nile. And you can see that Nubia is located below this area. And as the Egyptian pharaohs and Egyptian kings expanded their territory and unified more and more of their country along the length of the Nile River, they eventually were able to go as far as the first cataract of the Nile. Now, the Nile River has its sources high in the mountains in northern Africa. But Egypt, as we will be thinking of Egypt, is generally this area that we're looking at that I have designated with arrows. Now, the word Ennead really means a collection of 9, or the 9th of something. However, it is a term that's used by the Egyptians themselves to mean any kind of a collection or generation or emanation of gods or godhead. So that an Ennead may contain 8, it may be an Ogdoad, or it may contain as many as 15. Now, at Heliopolis, the great god, or the first true god who is the creator of this world, was known as Atum. We're looking at a little diagram in German, but you'll see that Atum is at the top of this, and a little arrow goes from him to Tefnute and Shu, and from them to what we would know as Geb and Nut, and then from there to the 4 deities, the great deities that were worshipped in Egypt: Osiris, Izide is Isis, Nephte, and Set. This is the way that Atum is usually portrayed. Of course, he's a god. He holds the was wand and he holds the Ankh, and he wears that type of a garment, and with that type of a thing that looks like a feather coming out of the garment. Now, we're going to take a look at the concept of the creation of the universe and of the world that was developed here. But I want to point out that this concept is emanational. In other words, an original great creative force that is often considered to be, as the Greeks do, chaos, or in the case of the Egyptians, Nun, which is an undifferentiated divine reality, often represented just by a lake. From that emanates a series of divine essences or divine beings. It's kind of stepping down a ladder of hierarchy to finally those who would actually create the world and create human beings. Now today, Heliopolis, or Lunu, is really covered by the suburbs of northeast Cairo. But about 3000 BCE, this was where this very important and influential creation myth was developed. The earliest written sources of this don't come until the 5th and 6th dynasty, but they were developed by the priesthood, and until Thebes became the administrative center and the spiritual center of expanded Egypt, and the god Amun was understood and described as the primordial force in the universe. This theology held sway, and Atum was the basic source of all things in this theology. So this, in fact, if you count them, will make 9. This is a true Ennead, an Ennead of gods. But they are not gods that exist in necessarily in pairs, and certainly not in triplets. But it is the beginning of what later in Gnosticism will be called the pleroma of eons. This concept is carried throughout Egyptian theology. They are the primordial divine emanations that eventually produce the physical nature that we see and human beings ourselves. So in the beginning, before the structured cosmos was created, there was darkness. And it held a limitless kind of water. It was the primeval, what was called Nun, the father of gods. It was that out of which the gods were distilled or emanated. And we find in Egypt no temples built to Nun, because Nun is not a god in the sense of a locatable god. Nun is something like infinity, but in many shrines and in all the symbols of ancient Egypt, the lake represented this primordial beginning power. We see it represented in the creation myth even of the Babylonians and of the Hebrews, that first there's a great water, which is then differentiated and so on. So the concept of primeval waters are common to all the Egyptian creation myths, and this is the source of all things. And out of Nun arose the creator of the world, Atum. And Atum means the primeval mound, which was known as a benben, and that is what we think of as a pyramid. The primeval mound is a pyramid-shaped stone. And but he's also a deity, a being. And he's known as the Lord to the limit of the sky and the Lord of Heliopolis. And he self-developed into a being standing on this raised mound, standing atop this pyramidal rock structure. And so he generated himself. He was an autogenes. And this concept of the self-generated or the self-generating one is a very important concept we'll see thousands of years later in Gnosticism. So he is the creator God, Atom, who creates the universe. He's the supreme being and the master of the forces and of all the elements of the universe. In the pyramid texts, we're told, O Atom, when you came into being, you rose up as a high hill. You shone as the Ben stone in the temple of the Phoenix in Heliopolis. So we can understand how people would come up with this idea. The Nile River would flood in the spring as the snows melted up in the headwaters. And the flood would bring with it a very large expansion of the river that would bring new nutrients to the river, new mud and other kinds of things that would come down. And then eventually the river would shrink back again, and all that area, acres and acres of land on either side of the river, would now be cultivatable. And it would be, in fact, it would be black looking. The name for Egypt is Kene, which means the black land. And that's the root of words like chemistry and alchemy. And it's called the black land because when it's fertilized in this way and ready for cultivation, the soil looks all black because the waters are retreated as like mud flats. And this is why the Egyptians were able each year to cultivate the same ground over and over again and stay in one place, remain in one place, and the ground would be fertile each year. In other places, they would have, all the nutrients would have come out of the soil and it would have become a desert. But the same thing obtained along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers for the Babylonian cultures. And so the river was terribly important. The river was the source of life. The country lived along the river. And the flooding of the river each year was extremely important. People would know when the river flooded because the astronomers would search for the star Sirius. And when finally the zodiacal signs in the skies had approached the right time of year, the star Sirius would start to appear on the eastern horizon. And when that came, the star Sirius, which was very often associated later in the myths of Isis and Osiris with Isis, then we would know that this land, which now in the hot summer and all the seasons since the harvesting had become like a dried out desert, would again become inundated and become fruitful, fructified and so on. So it is said of Atum that all manifestations came into being after I developed. No sky existed, no earth existed. I created on my own every being. My fist became my spouse. I copulated with my hand, and I sneezed out, Shu. That's easy to remember. It's sort of like Kerchu. What is Shu? Well, Shu represents the air or space. I spat out Tefnut. Who is she? Tefnut represents the dew or the moisture of the air, and possibly the moisture of the air of the underworld. So you see now that we have a dyad, a male and a female. This would be called, in the Gnostic schemes, a syzygy. In Tibetan Buddhism, it would be a Yab-Yom deity that is male-female. In the scheme of angels that were developed after the Jewish priests had many generations of contact with Babylonian ideas, the ideas of angels. And the angels are what? They are both male and female. They are androgynous. We don't have male angels and female angels. So two of these beings, Shu and Tefnut, is kind of equivalent to one angel. or to a Yab-Yom deity. And they're seen as male and female because they operate together in order to, through generation, to create the next really important dyad. They generate Nut and Geb. Now, Nut represents the sky, but not so much the day sky, but the starry sky at night. It is said that the sun enters into Nut when it sets at nighttime, and then is reborn when it rises in the morning, and reborn from her womb. Geb is male. Geb is the earth. So here we have a female sky god and a male earth god, which is pretty much backwards from the way it is in the patriarchal cultures and religions that will later take over the whole area of Egypt and Europe. So Nut is the goddess, and Geb is the god, who represents the earth. So, as it says in the text, next Shu and Tefnut produced Geb and Nut. And Geb and Nut then gave birth to Osiris, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys, 2 male and 2 female deities. And ultimately they produced the population of this land. And that is the way we're told. So Shu and Tefnut were the parents of Geb and Nut, and in the Book of the Dead, that is the book of going forth by day, the air god or space god Shu is seen wearing an ostrich plume, which is the hieroglyph for his name, and he's depicted as lifting up the sky goddess Nut, separating her from her spouse Geb, the earth god, and acting like a barrier. This is something like what would be considered to be the firmament in the creation story of the Hebrews. Now, the next part of this creation myth is the story of the Passion of Osiris. And we will reserve telling that story for a little bit later when we talk about the mysteries of Osiris. This is a painting of Nut and Geb. As you can see, Geb is ithyphallic. He's got a very long penis. This particular position with the woman on top is a position for sacred intercourse for later on in the temples of Isis in Egypt and in other sacred Egyptian temples. There was a tradition of what we call sacred prostitution. And that was not considered, the person who did this was a priestess, and she was not considered to be a slut or a whore. She was considered to be a sacred prophetess. And this is the position that she had intercourse with those who patronized the temple. And so this is what we call ancient Egyptian position number 1, but American position number 65 or something like that. It was very interesting because Egyptian religion was essentially somewhat unbalanced toward the matriarchal side. And you see that as you watch over the evolutions of religious history in the Osirian mysteries, as you watch Isis become more and more important until finally they're really the mysteries of Isis. And even Osiris is assimilated into Apis the bull and becomes Osirapis or Serapis in the later Hellenistic period. So there are many things about the Egyptian religion that are really quite matriarchal. This is an early representation of Osiris. You notice that he holds the shepherd's crook in one hand, and you will notice that he has usually this sort of a headdress. But over 2,000 years, the face of Osiris develops, and the iconography of Osiris takes on the iconography of the Greek Zeus. and becomes Osirapis or Serapis. And this iconography of Zeus or Jupiter or the god of the heavens or Osiris becomes a universal iconography for the god we just know as capital G, God, and as a male, of course. And this iconography is something that develops as patriarchy takes its hold over all the lands of the European and Mediterranean lands in the next couple of thousand years. Now, the story of Osiris is very simply that he is murdered by Set, his brother, and he's dismembered so that he can't return. He can't bring himself back together again, and the body parts are scattered all over the Nile. His son Horus, in some stories, and sometimes just Isis, but in the earliest stories it was Horus, and then it became Isis, go together and collect or recollect or remember the body by joining all the parts together again. And this, by the way, is the root of our word remember. It means to join together things that have been dismembered. And dismemberment is a very, very, very important part of shamanic initiation. Now, the myth or legend, if it's based on historical events of Osiris, tells that Horus, the son and successor of Osiris, the one who would be his rightful successor, gathers the pieces together and magically brings Osiris back to life, and Osiris ascends into the spirit world of his ancestors, the gods. In its earliest version, this probably reflects an initiatory ceremonial death rite for a dead shaman king. Unlike the rites for common people, the shaman king's rites rescue him from the underworld or lower spirit world and symbolize his ascension into the higher realms of the gods after death. In other words, into the night sky. Now you have to understand that the night sky is associated with the underworld. When the sun sinks into Amente, into the underworld, at nighttime and sets, the sun is going back to its home, and its home is what? Its home is the night sky, the starry sky. And it is the starry sky that is the sacred sky, and that is the abode of the gods. And so there's not really a great contradiction between descent into the divine underworld and ascent into the stars. So these rites for a dead shaman king could only be conducted by his son and his successor, who would be represented by Horus. And this dismemberment of Osiris is reflected in the cutting open of the body for removal of the organs for replacement in canopic jars, and the magical reassembly of the body by Horus reflected in mortuary priestcraft. And however, more than that, dismemberment is a very basic part of shamanic initiation. It's archetypal in Near Eastern religion of the period. You find the same in the mysteries of Tammuz or Adonis. In the Greek islands, Orpheus was torn to pieces by the crazed women of the Omophagian. And why is dismemberment so important? A study of shamanic practices throughout the world, if you read Eliade's Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, for example, gives the answer. Dismemberment is the final initiation for the shaman. And by the way, that would be equivalent in the Christian legend to crucifixion. It represents disattachment and total disassociation with the old human form. It's necessary for apotheosis. To become a god, one has to become totally disattached from the human. In the later mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus, this is accomplished in the liturgy of rebirth, as the student sees his physical body disappear and finds his zodiacal body, his divine body. And in the Christian mysteries related by St. Paul, the psychikos body, the psychic body, is replaced by a pneumatikos body, a spiritual body, just as the seedling replaces the seed in the process of physical death. So for the Christian, dismemberment is equivalent to crucifixion, or the inner struggle between the old Adam and the new Adam. In general terms, dismemberment is a symbol for shamanic illness, and magical reassembly a symbol for victory. And in many shamanic traditions, the shaman symbolically dismembers and then now, the story of Osiris is very simply that he is murdered by Set, his brother, and he's dismembered so that he can't return. He can't bring himself back together again, and the body parts are scattered all over the Nile. His son Horus, in some stories, and sometimes just Isis, but in the earliest stories it was Horus, and then it became Isis, go together and collect or recollect or remember the body by joining all the parts together again. And this, by the way, is the root of our word remember. It means to join together things that have been dismembered. And dismemberment is a very, very, very important part of shamanic initiation. Now, the myth or legend, if it's based on historical events of Osiris, tells that Horus, the son and successor of Osiris, the one who would be his rightful successor, gathers the pieces together and magically brings Osiris back to life, and Osiris ascends into the spirit world of his ancestors, the gods. In its earliest version, this probably reflects an initiatory ceremonial death rite for a dead shaman king. Unlike the rites for common people, the shaman king's rites rescue him from the underworld or lower spirit world and symbolize his ascension into the higher realms of the gods after death. In other words, into the night sky. Now you have to understand that the night sky is associated with the underworld. When the sun sinks into Amente, into the underworld, at nighttime and sets, the sun is going back to its home, and its home is what? Its home is the night sky, the starry sky. And it is the starry sky that is the sacred sky, and that is the abode of the gods. And so there's not really a great contradiction between descent into the divine underworld and ascent into the stars. So these rites for a dead shaman king could only be conducted by his son and his successor, who would be represented by Horus. And this dismemberment of Osiris is reflected in the cutting open of the body for removal of the organs for replacement in canopic jars, and the magical reassembly of the body by Horus reflected in mortuary priestcraft. And however, more than that, Dismemberment is a very basic part of shamanic initiation. It's archetypal in Near Eastern religion of the period. You find the same in the mysteries of Tammuz or Adonis. In the Greek islands, Orpheus was torn to pieces by the crazed women of the Omophagian. And why is dismemberment so important? A study of shamanic practices throughout the world, if you read Eliada's Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, for example, gives the answer. Dismemberment is the final initiation for the shaman. And by the way, that would be equivalent in the Christian legend to crucifixion. It represents disattachment and total disassociation with the old human form. It's necessary for apotheosis. To become a god, one has to become totally disattached from the human. In the later mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus, this is accomplished in the liturgy of rebirth, as the student sees his physical body disappear and finds his zodiacal body, his divine body. And in the Christian mysteries related by St. Paul, the psychikos body, the psychic body, is replaced by a pneumatikos body, a spiritual body, just as the seedling replaces the seed in the process of physical death. So for the Christian, dismemberment is equivalent to crucifixion, or the inner struggle between the old Adam and the new Adam. In general terms, dismemberment is a symbol for shamanic illness, and magical reassembly, a symbol for victory. And in many shamanic traditions, the shaman symbolically dismembers and then reassembles himself. And often dismemberment is associated with magical food, the flesh or blood of a god or a totem animal that is offered ritually only on a special occasion, and then transmits through its blood or flesh the power of spiritual overcoming to the worshiper. And so we have sacred things like the Keizer of the later Eleusinian tradition, which was probably instituted as a counter-ritual to the wine of the Dionysian ecstasies. And things like the Jewish Passover meal became the Christian Eucharist, or possibly the Seder meal that became the Christian Eucharist, and the blood of Mithraic bull sacrifices and so on. And in all these cases, dismemberment, or the death passage rites of the first shaman, the primal hero like Orpheus or Jesus, are taken as substitute for dismemberment of the succeeding shamans. So this is the case for the Osirian tradition, where the worshiper identifies with Horus, not with Osiris, not specifically with Osiris except at certain times for certain things, and then ascends to the heavens in the identity of the son of Osiris. The worshiper will be dismembered by Set, who represents death, but reassembled and resurrected through the power of the ascended Osiris. And so this is the meaning, the shamanic meaning of this, and it was probably a ritual that was done by the son when his father died, as he would inherit the throne, which would eventually become the throne of Pharaoh. And Osiris would then be the eternal lord in the divine underworld, which also means in the stars of the night sky. So the Pharaoh and his successor son were probably the ones who worked with their priesthood to go through these initiatic rites, which were developed originally from older shamanic practices. Now you have to realize that Egypt is like a string of pearls. Each of the villages and the centers of population along that river, which were not originally connected with each other in a country, they were united first by King Menes, who established the first dynasty of rule. And then the more and more villages were added to this as they were conquered and added. There was a great deal of advantage, of course, to being part of the larger Egypt, because it gave you protection, food in the times of famine, and if your particular area was had been ravaged by thieves or whatever. And it also provided a connection that later on became very, very important for trade and the expansion of the economic basis for any village. So it was advantageous for different villages to join, but each village had its own kind of temple and its own shamanic basis. Each had its own totem animal, Soc Neptunus, the crocodile god, or various others. And all these were added into the Egyptian pantheon. And the Egyptian pantheon is full of all these human-bodied gods with animal heads. And the animal heads represent the original totem animals that were part of the shamanic tradition of each of these villages. And as they were united, and there got to be a priesthood for the royal family in the royal house, the son, who would be playing the role of Horus, would work in the mortuary dismemberment and magical reassembly of the father, who would then join Osiris, and the father of the pharaoh would be ruling in the divine underworld and as part of the grand body of Osiris, and also would be available through priestcraft for advice and counsel and psychic guidance at times, because of the special preparations that were done in death. And so the son depended very much upon his priests, especially when he was younger. And of course, as you can see, the priests were in a position of great power because they could communicate whatever messages they wished to the young new pharaoh, and could control very much what happened this way. Now, as the myth developed over a millennium, Isis became much more important as a figure. Isis originally was represented by Sirius, the dog star, and it was said that the Nile River, which was symbolized by Osiris, who was the fructifier and came up out of the earth to fructify the land, etc. The water would rise up out of the earth. That the two had to be together. The two had to work together. The star Sirius, which represented Isis, would announce the rebirth or the resurrection of Osiris, which was the rising of the Nile. And without the reappearance of the star, there was no rising of the Nile. And so Isis became more and more important, and of course, her son, Horus, and the myth took on a life of its own, independent of simply the pharaonic circles in the pharaonic court of Pharaoh. And the child Horus, who was known as Horus Harpocrates, and his mother Isis became a very important symbol for rebirth and resurrection. We find them together represented as mother and child. And by the Hellenistic period in Egypt, which is one of the earlier places where Christianity took hold, we find little carvings and statues of the mother and the child, and we really cannot tell until we look at very fine details whether we're looking at a statue of Mary and Jesus or Isis and Horus. It's very interesting that in Christianity, the nativity of the Christ child is at the winter solstice at exactly the same time as the birth of Ian Horus, the new sun. Horus is represented by the birth of the sun. The sun goes down lower and lower in the sky day after day throughout the fall until it reaches the lowest point in the sky and the coldest part of the winter. And the day that it starts to rise up in the sky day after day, to come higher and higher in the sky at the zenith, the day that begins is the winter solstice, and was the original Christmas, which is the time that the original Christian Christmas was established. So the winter solstice is the birth of Ian Horus as well as the birth of Jesus. And the nativity of the baby Jesus got to be celebrated probably first in Egypt in 4th, 5th centuries as a kind of to supplant the traditions of Isis and Horus, because originally when the Christian families in Egypt, you can imagine being father and a mother and having children, and the great day for all Egyptian children was the winter solstice, the birth of I and Horus, because at that time the children all got presents. So giving presents to children at the time of the winter solstice, or at the time of the birth of Horus, Horus Harpocrates, was a wonderful time if you were not Christian, if you were an Egyptian child who was a member of the Isis cult. But if you were a Christian child, you saw all the other kids getting presents, that made things kind of tough on your parents. And so very quickly, Christianity instituted the nativity of the Christ, which was at the winter solstice and a time when children were given presents. And this is the way traditions move through religions, and how they, it's like religions are like different tents, but they're all erected on the same tent pegs, the same tent poles. And you see the archetypal designs in each of them. So this is really the origin of the Christian Christmas, even though later on the Puritans and people would claim that there were other pagan origins for it. But this is the true origin of our celebration of Christmas, even according to the legends in the New Testament about the birth of Jesus. He would not have been born at the winter solstice. He would have been born at the time that the lambs were being born, which was would make him an Aries or something. He would be born in the spring. But the celebration of the nativity of the baby Jesus was really determined by the celebrations that we had from Isis cult in that time. Another thing that we get in Christianity from this same religious practice is that 8 days after 1 week and 1 day after the celebration of the birth of I and Horus would be what was called the Epiphany of I and Horus. That would be the first time that the sun would have become strong enough you could actually feel the warmth of it, and it was known as the manifestation or Epiphany. And this became, in Christianity, was connected with the legend of the visits of the Magi and with the circumcision of Jesus on the 8th day, and it became eventually in the church calendar the celebration known as the Epiphany, or the Feast of the Epiphany, again 8 days after the winter solstice. Because of precession of the equinox and change of the calendars, we celebrate Christmas now a few days after the winter solstice, on the 25th rather than on the 20th or 21st or 22nd. Here is a carving that we would find from the Hellenistic period of a mother and a child, and it would be very difficult to identify whether this is a Christian or an Isaian carving. Here is a painting of a mother and child. Again, it's very difficult to identify whether this is Christian or Isaian from the same period. However, from the ancient period, it was easy to identify, because in the ancient iconography, Isis would always have the lunar horns on her head, which you can see in this picture. And here's the Hellenized version much later, and you can see what we're starting to see here is not Isis and Osiris. We're starting to see the Virgin Mother Mary and the baby Jesus. So we have a divine family, a trinity, Isis, Osiris, and Horus. And these gods are unlike all the other Egyptian gods. They don't have animal heads. Priests can't wear their faces as masks. The priests as shamans, can wear the animal heads of all the other deities and perform the functions of them. But they can't be Osiris, they can't be Isis, and they can't be Horus. Because Isis, Horus, and Osiris are the divine family, the pharaonic family. And so they are the anthropomorphic gods. In fact, the first gods that we find in the ancient world that are shaped like humans, have human faces, human heads, and human bodies. And they become the Holy Family of Egypt. The Osirian priestly mysteries developed on this basis. And as Isis became more and more important in the mysteries, she took on the same characteristics as the Greek Sophia, or wisdom, and she took on herself the status of the Greek Demeter as the Magna Mater, and she was the one who was the gifter and of all these wonderful sciences to humanity. She taught agriculture to mankind. She taught in the Hermetic mysteries, all the great mysteries of astrology and so on, the mortuary sciences, came through Isis. And as a matter of fact, women probably were the first scientists. Women were the ones who figured out how seeds worked and how to plant and do agriculture. And they figured out how animals procreated and how to domesticate things. And they probably were the first great inventors and scientists. And this is this is brought forward in the attributes of Isis, who is the through Thoth, or Thoth Hermes, gives to mankind all the secrets of the great Hermetic sciences. And not only that, the Isean temples, as we will see later, and the temple mysteries are actually the source of much of the early Christian liturgy. If you take a look at Module 8 in this series on the Hellenistic mysteries, we'll show you what went on in a Hellenistic Isean temple and how it was adapted over to become matins and morning song and evening song and all the other celebrations that were done in Christian celebrations. So here we have the Osirian Trinity, the Holy Family, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And as you can see from the three of them sitting together, you see that Isis holds the symbols of the pharaoh, the symbols of the rulership of Upper and Lower Nile, Upper and Lower Egypt. But on this particular representation of Isis, she does not have the horns, but very often she's represented as winged and in other kinds of ways. And here you see on the left-hand side, you see Horus, and Horus does not, in this particular case, and very often is represented not with a human face, but with the face of a falcon. And the sun over his head, the sun over his head. And so in life, Horus would always be transformed into Osiris, because Osiris would be the pharaoh, and the successor of the pharaoh would be a human being. But Horus, in the role of Horus, would be the way that this successor would achieve a succession, and it also became the way in the Egyptian books of the dead that people gained entrance into the holy places and the higher places of sacred death. Now, you recall that I said there were three aspects of the mystery religions that you will find common in Egyptian and Greek and Hellenistic mystery cults. And there are the same three aspects we'll find in the mystery religions in the Osirian initiatic dramas of immortality. We'll find what we would refer to technically as tadromana, which is, of course, a Greek word, not an Egyptian word. The things done, in other words, dramatic enactment, or things that are done by the person as liturgy. Talagomena, the things that are spoken, the information that's given, and very often the myth itself that is recited as part of the drama. And degnumena, the things that are shown, the sacred things that are shown. And you will see all these elements as we take you through an Osirian initiation as we best are able to reconstruct it. Now, here are some things I just want to show you that are characteristic of the kinds of paraphernalia that are used in initiatic and priestly work. The was wand. You might recall that when Moses came to the court of Pharaoh to demand that Pharaoh let his people go, that the Egyptian priests threw their staffs down on the floor and they turned into serpents. And Moses threw his staff down the floor, turned into a way bigger serpent, and ate up all their serpents. Well, this is what the staff looked like. This is a representation of Anubis, who is the psychopomp, or the person who leads the initiate forward into initiation and also into death. And this is the serpent, actually winged serpent, wand or staff that he holds. The winged serpent, or the fire serpent, became later what in Hebrew religion was one of the great guardians of the throne of God, the seraphim. The seraph was a fire snake. Here we have Horus holding the symbols of his authority, and a priest with the was wand and the lotus representation of the of rebirth, and so on. So you'll see this used quite often. You'll see this represented many times, the was wand. The next thing is that you have to understand that there was, that when one spoke to the gods or inquired of the gods, one didn't just speak as you would to a human. You sung or you chanted, or whether you speak to gods or angels. And this canting or enchanting was done very often rhythmically. And the way the rhythm was kept was with a sistron or a sistrum. This is what the sistrum looked like. It has a little, you notice it has a little cat carved on it. The Egyptians were one of the first to domesticate cats. And I'm talking about large cats too, not just small ones. And so there are little rattlers that go through this thing that's shaped like kind of a rattle. Here's an actual sistron with the face of Isis on it. The priestesses of Isis chanted and sung and danced using the sistron as a rhythmic instrument. Well, now we've looked at the basic theology that came from, it's associated with Heliopolis, which is no more. It's just under a lot of buildings in Cairo now. But at the main and central location for the administration and the religious priesthood of all Egypt that eventually developed, Thebes, which is actually one of the most southern points on the Nile, was developed the concept of Amun, or Amun-Ra. And the trinity of the early gods, Amun and Mut and Khonsu. Amun means something like unknowable, ineffable, cannot be understood. The earliest references come in the 5th dynasty, and the king sits upon the throne of Amun, and he is referred to as the one who is too great to inquire into and too powerful to know, the unknown God, so to speak. Technically, the name Amun implies the meaning of to conceal, and he's known as the hidden one, the concealed one. And he was too much of a mystery to be explained. He was too vast and impossible. And it was even said that the other gods were totally unaware of his true form because they were created later than him and by him. And so he's invisible, and very often he's associated with the wind or the breeze or spirit. His element in the Ogdoad of gods shows him with 2 high plumes on top of his heads, and the plumes are a sign for wind or air. So Amun is the creator of the gods. He was part of the Agdoad of the deities, but he was the one God. So he was part of them, but also the creator of them. And he created all the deities in this way. The event is described as the fluid of Amun, which came together with his body and formed a cosmic egg. And now we also have associations with a concept of a giant bird or a great goose, or who gave a great screech and began the creative energy of hatching the cosmic egg and so forth. So Amun-Re, the king of the gods in the New Kingdom, the Theban priests maintained that Amun created the primeval mound, Atum, and that all other deities were manifestations of Amun, and so he was also the sun god. And references to him as Amun-Re are many. Re means sun. He was depicted with a lion and the solar disk, and there are three deities that are more knit to Amun than others, and that is Re, the sun, as his face, and Ptah as his body. Ptah was also the high god associated with Memphis, and Amun as his invincible or invisible identity. And so there are many things here, but Amun is depicted very often as a trinity or a triad. There is Amun, who is the king, and Mut and Khonsu. Now, Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten as we know him, or Ikhnaten, was the pharaoh who was known as a heretic, and in popular stories and legends that we hear in the 21st century, in the 20th century, that have been promulgated, he was the inventor of monotheism and the idea of the one God. In fact, Ikhnaten tried to undo the worship of the one God, which was the god Amun or Amun-Re, and he tried to substitute himself as the primal deity. And this was something that he was able to get away with for about 18 years until he died. And then when he died, all the images he'd made of himself and all the changes he'd made in the priesthood were defaced and undone, and the priests went back to the way it had been done before. But it was he who married a commoner, Nefertiti. This is a representation of Ikhnaten, who may or may not have been a hunchback, may or may not have been deformed. We don't know, because the images of him make him look that way because he was despised so much by the priesthood, by the Theban priesthood. But here we have an image of him with his successor on the lap of his wife, Nefertiti, and the rays of the sun representing his rulership. And so the concept of Ikhnaten was monotheistic, but he was the one God, the concept of him as the one God. So to what extent that may have had any influence on Hebrew monotheism, here we're taking a look at a picture of the first temple with its columns and its altar. Whether that was anything that had anything to do with the development of monotheism in Judaism is probably very doubtful. Judaism was not monotheistic to begin with. It was henotheistic. It was like the Egyptian gods. It had many gods, and then the one God who created them all, and then there were other gods under them. And there was a council of gods. If you read the Old Testament, God is with all the other gods, and they're speaking together and deciding whether or not to cause the earth to be flooded because of the evil of the humans and so on. It speaks in the the Elohim, the gods, plural. And so it's only later that probably about 5th, 4th century before the Christian era that Judaism becomes truly monotheistic. Egyptian religion does very much the same sort of thing. And so it is quite likely, however, that there were great influences between Egyptian religion and Hebrew religion. We can find, if we read in the Old Testament, we can find a very large number of Old Testament psalms that are simply rephrasings of Egyptian psalms to Amun. And we can find in the wisdom literature and the proverbs of the Old Testament many, many proverbs that originally we find much older versions of in Egypt and in the Edomite literature. So a wonderful book to get is Pritchard's book called Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament, where you can see so much of the Old Testament already in pre-existing documents of pre-existing cultures. And you can see how these ideas ran down through the cultures. Now, Memphis was really the first priestly city of the Egyptian dynasties, of the united Egyptian dynasties. King Menes, when he united Lower and Upper Egypt, established his priesthood here at Memphis. And there was a concept of a one god at Memphis that was called Ptah. And Ptah was part of a kind of an Egyptian holy family trinity, Ptah, Sekhmet, and Nefertum. Here's a representation of them. Now at Memphis, which was the seat of intellectual tradition, of priesthood, that became far more profound than what we had at Heliopolis, tried to outrival the Heliopolitan priesthood and placed Ptah as the originator of all life. Now, as creator God, he was mentioned as early, very early in the Old Kingdom, when he was seen as a supreme artisan. And his high priest was then called the greatest of the controllers of craftsmen. In other words, Ptah is one who actually creates with his hands. In the coffin texts, he is described as one who creates other gods and makes the vegetation ripen and the sun shine. And in the period of the Ramesses, Ptah merges with Tat Enen, which means the land which has become distinguishable from the primeval waters. And so he comes into view at this point as the creator God. There's much more to say about this, but according to Memphite theology, Ptah created the universe using his heart and his tongue. And for the ancient Egyptians, the heart was the seat of thought, and by uttering the name of all things, he brought them into being. Because according to Egyptian belief in the name, or the Ren, or what later on Plato would see as the archetype of something, lay inherent the essence of a being or thing. So in this way, he created the other gods. And so here we have a God who creates by just speaking things into existence. We're talking about a God who creates just like Yahweh does in the Old Testament. So therefore, according to the Memphite priesthood, Ptah created even Atum at Heliopolis, and was therefore superior to the Aeneid and to the creation myth of Heliopolis. And so that they were all what he uttered and brought into being. So the Memphite theology was probably composed later in the New Kingdom after a lot of debate and discussion. And it's found inscribed on the Shabaka stone from the 25th dynasty, which is supposedly a copy of an Old Kingdom text. And we're going to quote from some of this theology. It is said of Ptah, he who made all and created the gods, and he is Ta-Ta-Nen, who gave birth to the gods, and from whom everything came forth, foods, provisions, divine offerings, all good things. This it is recognized, thus it is recognized and understood that he is the mightiest of the gods. Thus Ptah was satisfied after he had made all things and all divine words. In other words, he looked upon what he had created and he saw that it was good. And so you see very much similarity between the Hebrew creator God, etc. So here we have the one God who created with his word, with his tongue. Now, not much of Memphis remains. Here are some pictures of the area where Memphis once stood, because it was once a great complex of temples and tombs. Today, it's much overturned. It's a very ancient site, and very little remains of its former glory. It was important for the Theban priests to outshine and eventually overturn the Memphite theology, and they did do so because they were now part of the central administrative city and the pharaonic city of Egypt. Now we're going to talk about Hermopolis. Again, a Greek name that is described in the Hellenistic literature. And this is the city where another god becomes very, very important. His name is Jehuti, but we know him as Thoth, and he later becomes what's called Thoth Hermes. Now, Thoth is represented as an ibis-headed deity. The ibis represents the highest form of deity in the mortuary texts. And Thoth is represented in the mortuary text as the scribe of the gods. It's Thoth who stands at the weighing of the heart before Ma'at and inscribes the results of the weighing of the heart, and inscribes in the book of life, and the what are called, in fact, the term book of life originated in Egypt, that every event that a person does is recorded in the book of life. And Thoth becomes eventually associated with Hermes, with the Greek Hermes. And Hermes Thoth, or Tat, as he's known in the later Hermetic literature, or Thoth Hermes, is associated with Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in this temple, which remained a kind of stronghold of Egyptian priesthood even after the country was taken over and conquered by Alexander, and the generals and the descendants of the Alexander and the Ptolemies took over and turned it into a Hellenistic kingship, still at Hermopolis, the ancient and traditional Greek, or rather Egyptian priesthood was practiced, and the hieroglyphs were still written and known. And it was considered to be the most esoteric place in the Hellenistic world, the most esoteric place with all the secrets of Egypt in it. And the creation myth that was developed here was a myth of an Ogdoad. Now, the Ogdoad is a term that becomes very important in the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus. The Ogdoad is the eighth heaven, and after the eighth heaven comes the Ennead. And what I translated from the Non-Hammadi Coptic Gnostic Library for my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation back in the 70s, early 70s, was a document from Codex 6 of Nag Hammadi Codex 6, and the sixth tractate, which was an initiation document of an actual historical initiation, and the name of the document is the Ogdoad Reveals the Ennead. The 8th reveals the 9th, and the Ogdoad is that place where above in the 7 planetary spheres, the zodiacal sphere, where the great heroes of spiritual striving, the Hermetic saints, the Hermeses, the people who attain to the highest form of initiation, live as energies out of their bodies, guiding humanity. In other words, they're the ascended masters. And the Ogdoad is their place of their abode and their dwelling. And it's related very much also to the Gnostic pleroma of the eons, which are male and female syzygies. So here at Hermopolis, we have some very important developments that lead into later Hellenistic mysteries. There were 8 personified primeval forces, conceived of as 4 couples of deities, 4 male-female groups of deities, and the number 4 being the number of completion, tetractus. Completion, and showing the relationship with the Pythagorean thought and the tetractus and so on. And this is also known, this temple is also known under the name of Kmun, the town of 8, or the 8 town. It's difficult to understand a lot about the Hermopolitan theology. There's much personification of the couples of deities, and it talks more about the primeval physical matters of existence than the organic world. And only of these 8 deities, only Amun develops into a remarkable status with his female counterpart, Amunet. But the earliest references to the Hermopolitan cosmology is found in the pyramid texts, and it says, "You have your offering bread, O Nui and Nenet, you 2 protectors of the gods who protect the gods with your shadow. You have your offering bread, O Amun and Amunet, you 2 protectors of the gods who protect your gods with your shadow. You have your offering bread, O Atom and Ruti, who yourselves created your godheads and your persons. O Shu and Tefnut, who made the gods, who begot the gods and established the gods." So there are 4 pairs of deities. The Ogdoad, Nu and Nuanet are the primeval waters, Het and Huahet, boundlessness or infinity, Kek and Kwaket, darkness, and Amun and Amunet, air. And they were like the 4 elements out of which creation was made. And there was a concept of a cosmic egg. And it was the first of these things that were created. And the cosmic egg eventually forms a bird in the form of the sun. And so the great bird behind the sun is part of this Hermopolitan theology. To sum it up, all forms of initial creation happened in the darkness of the primeval waters. The creation was circular, as was the egg, and birth leads to decline, death, rebirth, renewal of cyclic existence. And it means that some things existed before existence. One of these was a Nun. Another would be primeval beings like frogs and snakes, which frogs were associated with fertility, and snakes with perpetuality and eternity, and rebirth as they shed their old skin. And the first creator God is created out of Nun by some interaction between these primeval creatures, and then the creator God creates the rest of the cosmos. And so in any case, it's a very complex Hermopolitan theology that synthesizes many things in the Egyptian mysteries. So this gives us the basis for what later will be understood in the Hellenistic period is the pleroma of the eons, the eonic syzygies, which we can compare to the Pythagorean tetractus, the Yab-Yum deities of Tibetan Buddhism, and so on. we have a primordial origin. And from that origin, we get a male and a female pair. And from that pair, we get another group of male-female pairs, and these male-female pairs produce more, etc. This is the concept of emanation. We will find it in the emanation of the 10 Sephirot, of Jewish Kabbalah, and the Pythagorean Kabbalah, and in the Gnostic eons, etc. And the importance of it is this. Yes, at some point, creation is like a craftsman making something out of existing materials, but ultimately the universe is emanated. All the universe is sacred. All the universe is part of the body of the gods and of God. So there is nothing that is unsacred. It's not like you have a split between the sacred and the profane, because ultimately all things are part of the divine. So emanation gives us a very, very much different look at reality than, for example, a dualistic version like we have in Christianity, where we have the divine and the creator God who creates human beings who are simply mortals versus immortals. We have mind versus body. We have good versus evil, etc. In this, ultimately, all things emanate from the God. They are emanated from deity. And that is what you will find in Kabbalistic and mystery traditions of all the religions, ultimately. Now, Thoth is represented with the head of an ibis, and he becomes the later Ptolemaic Hermes. This is a representation of Thoth, and you see him holding in his hand the Ankh. He is the holder to the keys of all the secrets and all the mysteries, and it was he that will reveal these mysteries to mankind, the mysteries that ultimately come through Isis are revealed to mankind through Thoth or Thoth Hermes. This is the ibis that is the bird that represents the highest divine elements in an Aeneid of any sort. Now, there were some other gods that were also defined, like Khnum in his potter's wheel, and he was the creator of humans who made them, just as St. Paul describes human souls being made by God as a potter, the potter's wheel, and so on. And Neith, or Net, or Nit, is a female creator, a creatrix. And we hear about her later in the Ptolemaic period, but actually she goes back to a very, very early period in the Memphite theology, and she creates by divine commands of her mouth. So she may be the matriarchal form of the creator God. These are some representations of Khnum. Here he is at his potter's wheel, creating human beings. And Neith is represented as very often as an archer, as an Amazonian kind of an archer. And you will find images of her very often guarding the dead. She sits with the dead in the coffins and the coffin representations. She is protector of the dead and protector of all elements of mortuary science. So now we're going to talk about what this whole business of divine transformation after death was all about. And this is epitomized in initiation into the priesthood, priestly initiation. In Osirian initiation, which was probably practiced very, very early on in Memphis, the Memphite priesthood, not only was the magical reassembly of the dead pharaoh's body practiced through the mortuary sciences, but the priests and priestesses who were part of that themselves participated in the same kind of initiation, shamanic initiation. in order to become priests, in order to be able to do this sort of work. And the representation of this rebirth or this resurrection or this living again after death very often was this little beetle, which we see in the form of scarabs, which the Egyptians thought had no mothers and fathers and were spontaneously generated, and that after they died, they would just generate themselves back again. And so they became the symbol of regeneration, the cycle of death and rebirth. Now we're going to be using as our sources the Papyrus of Ani, which is known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Book of the Coming Forth by Day. This is the book itself that is a collection of mortuary texts, spells, charms, and recitations and chants that were used both for the initiation and for the passing over to death, and for at first just the pharaoh, and the priesthood, and later on more and more people. And the importance of these books, the books of the dead, are that they show us and give us a great deal of insight into Osirian initiation, because the initiation into priesthood was a practice for one's own death. Initiation was a fore-liturgy, or a pre-experience of what one will experience at death, and by walking through that and learning all the parts of that, then at one's own death, one will be able to make the transition into eternal life. Now, we're going to look at what we believe was done at the temple of Osiris at Abydos. Abydos is, very close to where the Nag Hammadi Coptic Gnostic Library was discovered, and it's very close to Akhmim, which is the place to which the mysteries retreated and were held encapsulated with the domination of Christianity and Christian state religion. And they were able to survive there without being having mobs of angry people come and storm their places and kill them and tear them apart, etc. So this is the city to which really the essence of all the mysteries retreated with the coming of Christianity, Abydos. But in the ancient world, it was a city of priestly initiation. These are all the buildings that you will find there today. They're there from many, many different periods. You'll see a little key at the bottom. The blue things are from the modern period, and you'll see the things from the earliest dynasties in the sort of light, very light azure blue, and then a little bit later in a sort of gold and so on. And it's very difficult to know exactly how things were done at this site. Abydos today looks like this, and here this is a travelogue group of pictures. But if you look at the lower right-hand picture, this seems to be the Osirian. This seems to be the entrance into a place that had drained from underground channels from the Nile River, an underground lake that was used as part of these initiations. And people entered what was originally perhaps just a cave, and some parts of it have been discovered, and this is a drawing. It was made in the 19th century of some things that were discovered. But most of it has been destroyed. What we have today remaining are the parts that I was showing you that you can see are down, that extend down under the earth into the water table, and so could have been used to form the underground lake that was used as part of the initiation. We still have tunnels that go down under the earth. Some of these tunnels are for mortuary and grave places, but some of them we're not sure what they might have been initiatic tunnels. and they're rather large, and then they narrow down and become very small. Now, you might remember that Anubis, who is the jackal-headed deity, is the guide of souls, and he's the one who guides the soul after death to the divine court of Osiris, where the heart will be weighed, and that judgment will determine whether this person continues on into immortality or is cast back into various kinds of torment, or not is rejected and doesn't go forward. In other words, in the reincarnational system, we have to go back into incarnation. Anubis, or Hermanubis, is the deity that is the guide of souls, and the same is true of Hermes in the Greek tradition. Hermes is the psychopomp, the guide of souls, and we find Hermanubis as probably as a presider over mortuary rites. Priests that probably wore the head of the jackal-headed mask of Anubis when they did magical rites and prepared mummies and so forth. Much of the court of Osiris that we see represented when the heart is weighed before Ma'at, justice. Remember, the pharaoh is the person who is responsible for keeping Ma'at, or justice, in the land, and keeping the balance of justice. Without it, the whole cosmos turns upside down and doesn't function properly. But the court of Osiris is probably based very much on the court of the pharaoh and the ideas of the court of the pharaoh. Here we have a representation of the court of the pharaoh with Osiris and Horus, with the falcon-headed Horus, and with the moon-horned Isis. But this is who the divine family was thought to be, and people would come for judgment, and they would come to bring gifts and etc. That the pharaoh would meet with people each day who would come out of the court, and he would sit on the throne of Amun, and so on. So the representation of the court of Osiris after death, where one goes in order to determine whether he will go on into immortality or will have to return into rebirth, is probably based on these images. The Hall of Judgment, we've looked at before, is represented by a court, and here we see the ibis-headed god Thoth recording, the jackal-headed god Anubis weighing, and we see the scales of Ma'at, and we see deity is represented along here as this is being done. Ma'at is the representation of justice, fairness, balance, equity, and it is she that must be respected and honored by the living pharaoh in all of his work and administration over the kingdom. She's represented with this feather in her hair. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take you through an ancient Osirian priestly initiation adapted from Guillemot's manuscript, which is no longer published separately, called the Initiatory Process in Ancient Egypt, but it is still available through the AMORC, which is the Egyptian Museum in San Jose, California. And you should read the description of this in your printable materials as we go on with it. To introduce the reenactment, I'm going to sing to you in the ancient Egyptian language a hymn to Amun-Re, or to Ra, the sun god. And I'm going to put the English translation up for you to see as we move along. The first line does not have an English translation. It is a use of vowels for harmonic intoning. Hankutaseneb Arineteru Tuatensu Emarueth Neferem Kaef Ematet Tuatuheru Tuatukeru.
You sit alone in an underground cavern. You have no idea how large this tomb-like cavern may be. You can hear no sounds of life. It is pitch dark, and it matters not whether you close your eyes because nothing appears in the absolute blackness of this place.
You are a postulant for admission to the sacred rites of Abydos. You have spent years of study in advanced philosophy, theology, alchemy, and the sciences. You have followed rigorous dietary and moral regulations. You have prepared all your life for this initiation, which will begin your studies as a priest.
A deep voice summons you back to the door where you entered. As the door opens, a single torch illuminates the jackal-headed god Anubis. He is the guide of the soul, both after death and here in life to initiation, which is a preparation for immortality. The priestly mask of black and gold is expressionless. A deep voice within the mask speaks.
I am the jackal of jackals, the luminous air which carries away our breaths before the venerable ones, up to the regions of the heavens, up to the ends of the earth.
He leads you toward the guardian of the sanctuary, who cannot be seen in the dim light. The guardian places a black blindfold over your eyes so that you are in absolute darkness again, just as you were in the cavern. He questions you in a long ritual series for which you have been prepared and memorized the answers. You intone these words in answer to his questions. Open to me, I am one worthy of esteem, one who knows how to guard a secret, one who serves in the temple of Osiris. Open to me, I am one who knows its magical formulas. I was initiated into these things and did not reveal them to the uninitiated. Open to me, for I am Horus, son and heir of Osiris. Now you hear the gates to the sacred underground sanctuary of Abydos opened for you. Anubis silently takes you by the hand and leads you forward. At first you feel your way along a dank, long hallway cut into the earth. At this point on the journey, Anubis indicates that you must question Atum concerning the realities of death. You intone the memorized questions. Oh, Atum, why have I traveled to this deserted place? There is no water, there is no breeze of air. This place is profoundly deep, unutterably dark, having no limits or boundaries.
Here thou shalt live with thy heart at peace.
But here one cannot satisfy love. I no longer live in a physical body.
True, but it is here that I have placed the powers of mind instead of water, cool breezes, and the pleasures of love, and peace of mind instead of bread and beer.
And what will be the span of my life?
Thou shalt live for millions and myriads of years.
you are led before Thoth, scribe of the gods.
I am the one who records your every word and deed.
You are given final preparation for entrance into the hall of judgment and drilled on the many responses and formulas you have memorized. Now you are led before the scales of Ma'at, justice or truth or universal harmony. It is here that a ritual examination takes place in imitation of the final judgment, when your soul will be spiritually weighed according to what exists in your heart as a condition for entrance into the heavens of the gods. This part is a long liturgy of questions and declarations, but the final examination of your heart motivation is done by a psychic priest. There is great silence, and you feel the priest take both your hands. If he sees or senses anything within you that disqualifies you for initiation, you will be led away for many more years of training and study. But if you are judged worthy, you will be declared to be one with Ma'at, justice. Osiris, presiding over the scales, declares,
I grant thee the title of just and triumphant. In Ma'at thou art initiated.
Now your blindfold is removed. You are stunned by the light and beauty of the priests, the divine costumes and royal furnishings of the chamber of Ma'at. Osiris speaks.
Walk this underground path, following the light. You will come to an underground lake. At the opposite side of the lake, you will see a mound with dual steps leading up to my royal coffin and back down again. Immerse yourself in the sacred waters, leaving no part dry, and ascend the steps to my tomb, and behold what you will behold.
As you begin your walk, you hear the priests intoning the words of the ancient hymn to the sun.
Here we are ready to live again. We have entered into the primordial sea. It has restored vigor to him who begins his youth anew. Let the old man take off his clothes, then another one puts them on.
Masked priests surround you and remove your robe. This signifies death and loss of the physical body. You step naked into the vivifying waters of the Nile, Osiris. As you come up from the water and begin the climb of the 12 steps to the esplanade of Osiris, the stolesman clothes you in a pure white linen robe of priesthood. Now you are ready for the sacred vision that will bring you illumination. You gaze at the mutilated and dismembered head of the murdered Osiris lying in the tomb. You are unaware of how much time passes, but suddenly a brilliant light appears, momentarily blinding you. You nearly fall backwards.
The brightness of the light has fallen upon your steps.
Then you watch in amazement as the foliage surrounding the relics of Osiris suddenly come to life.
The living plant grows green. The earth becomes green also.
Now the holy sepulchre is opened by the priests. The head of Osiris speaks.
Let him advance toward me. Let him see my wounds.
Before your eyes, you watch the wounds of the battered and bleeding head of the murdered Osiris spontaneously heal, the face come to life, the wrinkled skin grow young and clear, and the god arise from death into life. Then the head of Osiris speaks.
Never reveal what you have seen, but let your heart and your life show forth in deed and action the hope and glory of divine life, eternal and immortal. Thou art a priest forever.